Hi, so I'm sharing lessons from Paul's letter first letter to Timothy. So he was one of the leaders of the church in Ephesus, which Paul established. And the issue that the church was having at the time when the letter was written was that it existed in the place where there were many false gods and theologies. So basically, Timothy had his work cut out for him trying to correct these issues in the church. And also, it appeared that they had a lot of people there who wanted to teach, but their doctrine wasn't sound to correct the false teachings that were there, but they wanted to teach nevertheless. Timothy was young, and Paul had tasked him with the challenge of stewarding or pastoring those proud and unteachable people who insisted on being teachers, even though they couldn't follow. And I dare say that they probably, didn't regard him as much because of his youth. From Paul's instructions on worship, this was in chapter 2, I learned something. It indicated that the men in that time were given to anger and quarrels, and the women were flashy, arrogant, and loud. So his advice to them was probably based on this fact. Now we've seen something like this, the instructions that he gave to the women in chapter 2, verses 11 to 15, and obviously they are varied they are varied schools of thought as it concerns to what they are saying. So there's no complete agreement in it, but just to give you some context, this is the part where Paul said that he didn't permit the women to teach, that he wanted them to be quiet and full of submission, because Adam was formed first, and Adam was the one who deceived Eve, and that the woman would get her deliverance or be saved through childbearing. There are so many different varied views. So personally, I'm choosing to interpret it the way I did when we read about it, something similar in Corinthians, and see that Paul was speaking to the women of the time and not to women in general. Now, character and timing are very important among leaders in the church from Paul's teachings in chapter 3. So more than skill, these are requisites for them to have. The only skill that he listed was that they be able to teach, but many people can do that. Anybody can teach, right? Well, most people can teach. I don't consider myself a teacher anyway. But Paul inferred that if leadership is given too soon, people are bound to be proud. So there's a whole, sort of formula for how leadership should go, or the whole process of it should go. Now, the Ephesians were given to believe in all kinds of teachings and doctrines, and so Paul wanted them not to follow those, especially those false teachers that gave them a list of do's and don'ts, very Pharisaic in nature. And he told them that as long as they were they could legitimately thank God for whatever they were partaking in, that it was all good. And I remember the scripture particularly stood out to me one time when I went on one of those diets. Well, it was like a fad. I don't know if I call it a fad, but I believed it's some kind of diet where they said, oh, don't eat this and don't eat that because it causes this in the body, it cures this, it cures some ancient guy. And I sat and I thought about it. This guy was not even a Christian. He didn't believe in God. But they said he had found some sort of way for a certain kind of diet to make sure that you had a healthier lifestyle. And it was like, don't do this, don't do that. And I did it for a while. But then one day when I saw the scripture, it just changed my whole perception about it. And I was like, right, that's the end of this fad diet. Because there was a period when I was always on some fad diet or the other. So he encouraged them that training and intentionality in godliness is very important. Now, one key takeaway for me was in chapter 6, where Paul talked about money. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with money, right? It is a blessing and it should be used to honor God. The love of money is where the problem lies, and it's best to hold it very loosely. I decided, just view it rightly as money. It's temporal, it's passing. Don't put your hope in it. Don't strive too much for it. It's important, but the God who made it knows that it is important and will provide for it for us. So we shouldn't be doing just anything for money. And that's a lesson that I think everyone, me included, need to learn, especially in this day and age that we're living in. So let me tell you what my hashtag getting to know God lesson was. Being godly and content should be our aim as Christians and God lovers. I thought that was very powerful. Being godly and being content. In chapter 6, verse 6 to 7, Paul says, "Godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and we will take nothing with us when out of it." So being godly and content is the best setup for our lives. Godliness is enough for our contentment, and knowing and obeying Christ is enough to give us joy. Thank you for joining me today. It's always a pleasure to share with you. And tomorrow I'll be sharing lessons from Titus 1 to 3. Hopefully you'll be able to join me, God willing. Have a wonderful day. God bless you.